The moment Mabel Walker stepped through the double doors of the Clearwater Valley Social Hall, she felt the betrayal like a blade between her ribs. Every long pine table was full. Every wooden bench carried its occupants pressed shoulder to shoulder, laughing, passing dishes, calling to one another across the warm, lantern-lit room. Women she had stitched quilts beside, men she had greeted at the general store, children she had watched grow from infants. Every single one of them had arranged themselves as though the seating chart of this harvest social had been drawn deliberately around her absence. She stood in the doorway with a jar of preserved peaches in her hands, peaches she had spent the better part of 2 mornings putting up in her father's old kitchen, and nobody moved. Nobody shifted an inch along their bench. Nobody waved her over or called her name. Dolores Hatch, who sat nearest the door, turned her broad back with the practiced ease of long habit. Margaret Finch glanced up from across the room, made direct eye contact with Mabel, and then leaned to whisper something to the woman beside her. Both of them laughed. Mabel's fingers tightened around the glass jar until she could feel the heat of her own shame turning into something harder, something more like fury. She had done nothing wrong. Not one single thing, except exist in this town as the daughter of the man they had all decided to hate by association, and that was a crime she could not undo, no matter how many jars of peaches she carried or how many times she smiled first and waited for a smile in return that never came. She was 23 years old, and she was very close to turning around and walking back out into the September dark and never coming back. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry because she had used up her tears on this particular wound months ago. And then the room shifted. Not in a way anyone could have described precisely, but she felt it, a current of attention that moved like wind over dry grass, starting at the far side of the hall and rolling toward the door. Conversations stuttered and stopped. Forks paused above plates. Even Dolores Hatch, with her deliberately arranged back, went very still. Mabel turned her head. He was already crossing the room. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that had seen serious weather and a hat he had not bothered to remove, which in this particular company was either an act of ignorance or an act of war. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had long ago stopped spending energy on anything unnecessary. A gunbelt rode his hips with the casual permanence of something that had grown there. His face was angular, sun-darkened, and entirely uninterested in the fact that every person in the Clearwater Valley Social Hall was now watching him. He was watching Mabel. He crossed the full length of the room without deviation, without stopping to speak to anyone, without acknowledging the whispers that rose in his wake, and he stopped directly in front of the long center table where a gap existed at the very end of one bench, a gap that had existed all evening because it was beside her jar of preserved peaches, and everyone had elected to leave it empty rather than sit near the space she might eventually occupy. He pulled the bench out slightly with one boot. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "There's a seat right here." The entire hall heard it. Mabel Walker looked at this man she had never seen before in her life, this dangerous-looking stranger who had walked into a community gathering and crossed a crowded room as though he had somewhere specific to be, and felt something unlock in her chest that she could not immediately name. She lifted her chin, walked to that bench, and sat down. His name, she would learn, was Marshall Warren, and nothing in Clearwater Valley would ever be quite the same again. She had come to Clearwater 3 months before that September night, in the summer of 1882, arriving on the afternoon stage from Abilene with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a letter from her father's lawyer that contained more bad news than good. Thomas Walker had been many things in his 58 years. A surveyor, a speculator, a man who found gold where other men found only dirt, and then lost it again in the particular way that men with his kind of restless intelligence tended to lose things. He had also been the father Mabel had, which meant he was the father she loved despite the long absences and the borrowed money that never quite got repaid, and the letters from creditors that arrived at whatever address he had given them most recently. He had come to the Clearwater Valley 8 years ago, when Mabel was still in Ohio with her mother's sister, learning to sew straight seams and keep a proper household account. He had written her letters about the territory with the breathless enthusiasm of a man who had discovered paradise. The grass went on forever. The air smelled like sage and possibility. He had filed on a quarter section under the Homestead Act and built a house and planted a kitchen garden and acquired some cattle, and for a while, by the evidence of his letters, he had been genuinely happy. And then the letters had stopped coming, and then the lawyer's letter had arrived. Thomas Walker had died in April of a fever that had come on fast and ended faster. He had left Mabel his quarter section, his house, his kitchen garden, and a debt to a man named Aldous Crow that the lawyer had described in careful language as significant and of a somewhat complicated nature. Mabel had packed her 2 trunks and her carpet bag and come to find out what complicated nature meant. What it meant, she discovered within the first week, was that Aldous Crow was the kind of man who had spent 20 years making himself indispensable to this valley. He owned the feed store and held the paper on half the properties within riding distance of town, and he had the particular social power that comes to men who control resources in isolated places. He was also, it turned out, the reason no one in Clearwater Valley would save Mabel Walker a seat. Her father had borrowed from Crow 3 years ago, when the cattle had a bad year and the bank in Abilene had refused the extension. He had borrowed and promised repayment, and then, because Thomas Walker was the man he was, had borrowed again and promised again, and then died owing more than the quarter section was worth if you priced it honestly. Crow had not priced it honestly. He had gone around town in the weeks before Mabel arrived and told people, in the patient, concerned tone of a man who hates to be the bearer of bad news, that Thomas Walker had been a schemer and a cheat, and that anyone who showed kindness to his daughter was essentially endorsing the man's dishonesty. Mabel had not known any of this when she arrived. She had arrived smiling, carrying her peaches and her good intentions, and run directly into a wall of cold shoulders that had taken her several weeks to understand. By the time she understood it, she had also understood that dismantling it was going to be harder than she had resources for. Crow held the debt. Crow held the social narrative. And Crow, she had begun to suspect, also wanted her gone from the valley specifically, because she had shown a lawyer's letter to the county recorder's office and started asking questions about what exactly her father had signed. She was still asking those questions when September came and brought the harvest social with it, and she had made the mistake of thinking that perhaps 3 months of visible, decent behavior buying at the local stores, attending church, helping when asked, might have softened the ice enough to get through one evening without feeling like a ghost in her own community. It had not, until Marshal Warren crossed the room. He did not explain himself that night, not entirely. He sat beside her and ate roasted corn and said reasonably civil things about the weather and the quality of the fiddle player in the corner, and she learned his name and that he had ridden in from the south 2 days prior and was staying at the boarding house on Elm Street for reasons he did not specify. He was 31 years old. He had been in Texas before this, and before that, places he seemed disinclined to enumerate. What he did not do was explain why he had crossed that room. And she did not ask, because asking would have required admitting how much she had needed it, and she was not ready to be that vulnerable in front of a stranger with a gun belt. What she did notice was that his presence beside her had produced an immediate and measurable change in the social atmosphere of the hall. Men who had been ignoring her all evening found reasons to walk past their table. Dolar's Hatch actually turned around and offered a stiff, insincere greeting that was nonetheless a greeting. Even Margaret Finch, from across the room, stopped whispering and simply ate her supper with the focused attention of a woman who has suddenly found she has other things to think about. People were afraid of Marshal Warren. That was plain enough. And while Mabel was not in the business of hiding behind fear the way she was not in the business of accepting charity she hadn't earned, she was also practical enough to recognize that his presence had given her something valuable. A single evening in which she was treated like a person who belonged in the room. She walked home afterward under a sky so thick with stars it seemed like an excess, like God had been feeling generous. The night was cool and smelled of wood smoke and turned leaves, and she held her empty jar. Someone had actually taken some of her peaches, which felt like a small miracle, and tried to figure out what she thought about Marshall Warren. She thought he was dangerous in the way that some people are dangerous not because they are reckless, but because they are very, very capable. She thought he had seen her standing in that doorway and made a decision faster than most people make decisions. And the fact that the decision had been in her favor did not mean she understood his hidden motive, if he had one. She thought he had kind eyes, which was a treacherous thing to notice about a man who carried a gun the way other men carried a pocket watch, like it was simply part of how he moved through the world. She went asleep thinking about his voice, low and unhurried. Like someone who had decided long ago that if a thing was worth saying, it was worth saying at the right speed. The next morning she was pulling weeds from between the last of her garden rows when she heard a horse on the road, and looked up to find Marshall Warren sitting a bay gelding at the edge of her property line, watching her with the same patient attention he had brought to the social hall. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and kept pulling weeds, because she was not going to stand up and look foolish just because a man was watching her. He swung down from the horse and tied it to her fence post with the ease of someone who has done the same motion 10,000 times and came to stand at the garden's edge. "Your fence post is rotting on the south corner," he said. "Third one from the road." "I know," she said. "I could fix it." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Why? He seemed to consider this with more seriousness than most people would have. "Because it needs fixing," he said finally. "And because you're likely to lose half your fence come the first real wind if you don't. I can fix it myself." "I expect you can. Do you have the lumber?" She did not have the lumber. She had been meaning to go to the feed store for lumber, and she had been avoiding the feed store because Aldous Crow owned it and had a habit of doubling the price on items he sold to people he wanted to pressure, and she had run her arithmetic 3 times and had not yet found a way to pay Crow's price without giving up something else she needed. "Why did you cross the room last night?" she asked instead of answering his question about the lumber. He looked at her steadily. "Because nobody else was going to." "That's not an answer, that's an observation." The corner of his mouth moved very slightly in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile on a face that had not practiced the expression recently. "You were standing in that doorway with a jar of peaches," he said. "You'd clearly made an effort, and every single person in that room was pretending not to see you. That bothered me." "It bothered you," she repeated. "Yes. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't. Would you like to tell me something about yourself so I know you better?" It was so unexpected, so direct, and somehow so reasonable that she almost laughed. Almost. She had not actually laughed at anything in long enough that she was careful with the impulse. "My name is Mabel Walker," she said. "My father left me a quarter section and a debt I didn't choose. The man who holds the debt has decided to make my life difficult, and I have been in this valley for 3 months trying to mind my own business and be decent, and it hasn't worked particularly well." "Aldous Crow," he said. She looked at him sharply. "You know him?" "I know of him." He paused. "That's part of why I'm here, Miss Walker. Not entirely why I crossed the room." "That was what I said. I meant it as I said it. But my being in Clearwater is not entirely unrelated to Aldous Crow." There it was, the hidden motive. She felt it settle into the conversation like a stone into water, changing the surface of everything. "You had better tell me what you mean," she said. So he did, standing at the edge of her winter garden with his hat in his hand, which she noticed he had removed this time. He was, he told her, a deputy United States Marshal working out of the federal district office in Abilene. He had been sent to the Clearwater Valley because the federal land office had received a formal complaint. Several of them, in fact, from different sources, alleging that Aldous Crowe had been acquiring properties through fraudulent debt instruments. The loans he made were real. The interest he charged, however, was not always what had been agreed upon in writing, and the documents he produced when borrowers fell behind had a tendency to contain numbers and terms that the borrowers themselves did not remember signing. Thomas Walker's debt, according to the lawyer's letter, had grown from $200 to $850 in the span of 3 years. Mabel had read that letter 4 times. She had not been able to make the arithmetic of normal interest produce that number. "He's been doing it to other people," Marshal Warren said. "Some of them have lost their land. Some of them are still fighting it. The federal office wants the original documents. And they want them found before Crowe realizes we're looking." "And my father's papers," Mabel said slowly. "You think there's something in my father's papers?" "Your father was meticulous about keeping records. The lawyer mentioned it. If he kept copies of what he actually signed, and if those copies differ from what Crowe has filed at the county office, then yes." She stared at him. The September sunlight was warm on her shoulders, and she felt the world rearranging itself around her, the way it did when you finally got a piece of information that made everything else make a new kind of sense. "So you sat beside me at the social," she said carefully, "because you needed access to my house." "No," he said, and his voice was very clear, very direct. "I sat beside you at the social because no one else was going to, and it was wrong. I came here this morning because I need to tell you what I'm doing here and what I think might be in your house. Those are 2 separate things, Miss Walker, and I'd like you to understand that distinction." She studied his face. She was not, by nature or experience, a woman given to trusting easily. She had seen what happened to women who trusted easily, and she had developed a practical skepticism that had served her well. But she was also observant, and what she observed in Marshal Warren's face was a quality she could not immediately name and then could. He was telling the exact truth, not a convenient version of it, the actual thing. "All right," she said. "Then come inside." Her father's desk was a massive oak thing that he must have brought piece by piece on a wagon because she could not imagine how else it had arrived in this territory, and it was absolutely full of papers. Thomas Walker had been meticulous in the particular way of brilliant, disorganized men. Everything was there. Nothing was easy to find. They spent the whole of that morning going through it together, Marshal Warren on one side of the desk and Mabel on the other, and she learned a great deal about her father in the process that she had not known, including that he had been genuinely happy here in his last few years, in a way the letters had only hinted at. She found the loan agreement in the 4th drawer, tucked inside a surveying journal for 1879. $200 at 8% annual interest, repayable over 5 years. Thomas Walker's signature and a witness signature and a date, and the numbers were plain and clear, and nothing like the numbers in the lawyer's letter. Marshal Warren looked at it for a long time. "This is what we needed," he said. "This proves it. It's evidence. There needs to be more other borrowers, other documents, but yes, this is significant." He looked up at her. "I'm going to need to take this to Abilene." "I'll need a copy," she said immediately. "Of course." He met her eyes. "Miss Walker, I want to be clear with you about something. When Crowe finds out we're investigating, and he will find out, it's only a matter of time, things may become uncomfortable for you here. More uncomfortable than they already are. He has friends. Some of them are the kind of friends that men like Crowe find useful in situations like this." She understood what he meant. Men with guns. Men willing to do the kind of things that kept other people quiet. "I've been uncomfortable for 3 months," she said. "I'm not leaving." He looked at her as though she had said something that mattered. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't think you were." Over the following 2 weeks, they built a careful, cautious, and entirely practical working relationship. He came by her property most days, sometimes with a reason and sometimes without, and they talked. She told him things about Clearwater, who was allied with Crow, who was not, which families might have their own grievances, what she had observed in her 3 months of careful watching. He told her things about the investigation, within the limits of what was appropriate to share, and she appreciated that he was honest about those limits rather than pretending they did not exist. She also noticed things she had not expected to notice. He was very good with horses, which she respected. He ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint, which she valued because she was a plain cook with no pretensions. He had opinions about books, which she had not anticipated at all, and they had a spirited disagreement one afternoon about a particular chapter of a novel she had brought from Ohio that became something she thought about afterward more than was strictly necessary. He fixed her fence post. He brought his own lumber from the mill on the north side of town that Crow did not own, and he replaced the rotting post and checked the other fence posts while he was at it. And when she pointed out that she had not asked him to do the whole fence, he said, very reasonably, that he had been there already and it was not a significant additional effort. She did not argue, because she was practical and the fence needed doing. She noticed that he watched the road from wherever he happened to be sitting. Always. It was so habitual that she suspected he no longer even knew he did it. His eyes moved over a room the same way, cataloging exits and occupants with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent enough time in dangerous places that preparedness had become reflexive. It should have been unsettling. Somehow it was not. It was on the 15th day, a Sunday, when the situation changed. She had come back from the church service that she attended faithfully every week despite the cool reception she reliably received, and found a note tucked under her door. It was unsigned. It said, "Stop helping the marshal," or "Find out what happens to people who don't listen." She read it twice, standing in her kitchen with her church clothes still on, and felt the cold reality of it settle over her like weather. Then she went to find Marshal Warren. He was at the boarding house, and she knocked on the front door and told Mrs. Briggs, the landlady, that she needed to speak with Mr. Warren on a business matter, and Mrs. Briggs let her in with the expression of a woman who found the situation mildly interesting and intended to tell people about it later. Mabel did not care. She went upstairs and knocked on Marshal Warren's door and handed him the note when he opened it. He read it. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, something that went very quiet and very focused. "How long have you been back?" he asked. 20 minutes. "Did you see anyone near the house?" "No." "Who knew you had my father's document?" "Nobody, I told, but these things get out in small towns. Someone may have seen me find it or heard us talking." She paused. "This is Crow." "Almost certainly." He looked at the note again. "Miss Walker, I think you should stay somewhere else for a few nights. Is there anyone?" "No," she said flatly. He looked at her. "There is nobody in this town I trust enough to stay with," she said. "And besides, I am not going to be pushed off my own property by an unsigned note." "I understand that," he said, with a patience that did not feel condescending. "I also need you to understand that an unsigned note from someone connected to Aldous Crow is not a joke. The man has caused real harm to real people in this valley. I don't want you to be next." "Then figure out how to arrest him faster," she said. He made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, surprised out of him before he could choose whether to let it out. It transformed his face completely, just for a moment made him look younger, and warmer, and like someone she very much wanted to make laugh again. "I'm working on it," he said. "Work faster," she said, and left. But she did not sleep well that night. She lay in her father's bed listening to the sounds the house made and thinking about the note, and about Marshal Warren's face when he read it, that quiet, focused thing behind his eyes, and about what exactly it was that she felt when she was talking to him, which was a more complicated question than she preferred. She had not, since coming to Clearwater Valley, allowed herself to want things that were not practical. She had focused on the property, on the debt, on the slow, difficult work of establishing herself in a hostile place. She had put everything else, including loneliness and the particular grief of finding herself 23 and essentially alone in the world, into a box that she kept closed. Marshall Warren was making it harder to keep that box closed, and she was not sure what to do about it. The morning after the note, she went to see Arthur Prentice, who ran the small newspaper office on Main Street. She had been cultivating a careful friendship with Arthur for several weeks, based on the fact that he was one of the few people in Clearwater who had shown her genuine decency, partly because he was from back east himself and understood what it meant to be viewed as an outsider, and partly because he had his own reasons to distrust Aldous Crow, which he had alluded to but not explained. She explained to Arthur carefully what she had learned about the fraudulent debt instruments. She did not mention Marshall Warren by name or the federal investigation. She presented it as something she had discovered independently through her father's papers, which was true enough. She asked Arthur if he knew of other families in the valley who might have similar stories. Arthur was quiet for a long time. Then he said he knew of at least 4 families. He said he had been collecting information about Crow for nearly a year, but had not published anything because he was afraid of what Crow would do to his printing press, which was his entire livelihood if he published too soon. "What if it wasn't just you?" Mabel asked. "What if there were others willing to speak?" Arthur looked at her with something that was equal parts admiration and apprehension. "You're not as quiet as you look, Miss Walker," he said. "People keep making that mistake," she said. She spent the next 3 days visiting the families Arthur had mentioned carefully, quietly, arriving at back doors and leaving before noon. She heard stories that made her throat tight and her hands clench in her lap. The Harmon family had lost 40 acres. Old Pete Denton had given up his water rights. The Vasquez family, who had come north from Texas with a land grant going back to before the territory was American, had been fighting a claim Crow had filed against them for 2 years and were close to losing. She brought her notes to Marshall Warren on the 4th day and laid them on his table at the boarding house with the particular satisfaction of a person who has been doing useful work. He looked at the notes, he looked at her, and then he said very quietly, "Miss Walker, you went to those people alone?" "Yes." "After the note?" "Yes." "That was—" he stopped, started again. "That was extremely brave and also exactly the kind of thing that is going to give me gray hair before my time." She felt warmth bloom unexpectedly in her chest. "I was careful, Mabel." He said her given name for the first time, and then seemed to realize he had done it, and a very slight flush appeared along his jaw below the tan. He did not correct himself. "These notes are valuable. You gathered testimony that will significantly strengthen the case. You also put yourself directly in Crow's sights by talking to those families, and someone in this town is keeping him informed, and I need you to understand how much that concerns me." "It concerns me too," she said. "Which is why I want him dealt with before winter sets in and the road's close and we're all stuck here with him until spring." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The afternoon light came through the small window of his room and caught the green in his eyes. She had not noticed they were green before, a deep, serious green, the color of water in a deep well, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the investigation or the notes on the table or Aldous Crow. He looked away first, which surprised her. "I need to send these to Abilene," he said, "along with a request for additional resources. If we can get statements from the Harmon family and the Vasquez family in writing, and combine that with your father's original document, we have a strong enough case for federal intervention. Maybe 2 weeks more." "2 weeks," she said. "I know it's not as fast as you'd like." "No," she said, "but it will have to do." She stood to leave and he stood too, as men did in those days, a courtesy so reflexive it was automatic, and they were close in the small room, closer than they had been except for the night at the social, sitting shoulder to shoulder on that bench, and she was suddenly very aware of how close. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with this." "Don't make me regret it," she said, and meant it to sound practical, and it came out sounding like something else entirely, something softer and more serious. She left quickly, and stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house in the October sun and looked at the mountains in the distance, which were beginning to show their first white caps, and told herself to be sensible, and then conceded that sensible was possibly not entirely within her reach anymore. The next week was dangerous. Crow moved first, the way she had known he would. He came to her property on a Tuesday morning with two men she did not know, and a piece of paper that he said represented the formal calling of her father's debt, full amount due within 30 days, or he would file a dispossession claim at the county office. She stood on her porch and looked at him. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a prosperous belly and a prosperous mustache and eyes like creek stones, flat and gray and hard. He had brought his men, she noticed, because he expected to intimidate her. He expected her to cry or plead or bargain. She could see it in the way he held the paper, extended toward her like a gift. "Mr. Crow," she said pleasantly, "the amount on that paper is incorrect, and we both know it. My father borrowed $200. His original signed agreement reflects that amount, and I have a copy of it. I would encourage you to be very careful about what you file at the county office, because federal attention on fraudulent debt instruments is a serious matter." She watched his face change. The prosperous ease of it went somewhere else, and something colder took its place. "Your father was a fool and a cheat," he said. "My father is dead," she said steadily, "and he cannot defend himself. I can. Good morning, Mr. Crow." She went back inside and latched the door and stood with her back against it, shaking. Not from fear, or not entirely. From the effort of holding herself that still while she said those things. Marshal Warren arrived 20 minutes later because he had apparently been watching from the tree line, watching her property, she realized without telling her, which was both presumptuous and, she admitted privately, somewhat wonderful. She opened the door and he was already off his horse. "I saw Crow leave," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I told him about the original document." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was concern filtered through respect, filtered through something he was clearly trying very hard to keep sordid and professional. "You told him we have it." "I told him I have it. I didn't mention you." She paused. "Was that wrong?" "It tells him we're ready. He might accelerate or he might back down. Some men do when they realize the intimidation isn't working." "He's not going to back down," she said. "He's been doing this for years. He thinks he owns this valley." "He might be right about that," Marshal Warren said quietly, "which is why what comes next has to be done carefully." What came next came faster than either of them planned, because the man who was reporting to Crow, it turned out to be the deputy county sheriff. A discovery that neither surprised Mabel much nor apparently surprised Marshal Warren at all, got word to Crow that there was a federal officer in town, and Crow sent 4 men to the boarding house the following Thursday night. Marshal Warren was not at the boarding house. He had been having supper at Mabel's kitchen table, an arrangement that had developed with the natural logic of two people who kept finding themselves in the same place. And Mrs. Briggs had told the men who came looking exactly that, because Mrs. Briggs was loyal to her tenants but had not been told to keep his whereabouts quiet. They heard the horses on the road at 9 in the evening. Mabel was washing dishes and Marshal Warren was reading at her father's desk, one of the books from the shelf that he had been working his way through with her approval, and he was on his feet and at the window before the hoofbeats had fully registered in her conscious mind. "How many?" she asked, her hands still wet. 4, possibly more around the back. He was very calm. The calmness was not forced, she could tell. It was the genuine calm of a man who had been in worse situations and survived them by thinking clearly. "Is there a back way out?" "There is, but I'm not going anywhere." She dried her hands. "This is my house, Marshal." It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned and looked at her, and she could see in the lamplight exactly what it cost him to keep his voice steady. "You need to go to the back room and stay there," he said. "I'm going to go out the front and handle this." "They didn't come to talk to you," she said. "They came to frighten me. If I hide in the back room, it confirms to them and to everyone in this town that I can be frightened. I'm going with you." "Mabel, I'll stay behind you," she said. but I'm standing on my own porch." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, and she did not move or look away, and finally he said, "All right," in a tone that held both surrender and, she thought, something that was almost admiration. They went out the front door together. The 4 men were in her yard, 2 on horseback, 2 on foot. She recognized one of them, a man named Taggart who worked at Crow's feed store and had been one of the reasons she avoided going there. "Miss Walker," Taggart said, with a politeness that was an insult wearing politeness as a costume, "Mr. Crow would like a word." "It's 9 o'clock in the evening," she said. "If Mr. Crow wants a word, he can come himself in daylight." "Mr. Crow is a busy man." "So am I," she said. "Good evening." Marshal Warren had not said anything. He was standing slightly in front of her and slightly to her left, and he had not moved and he had not spoken, and the 4 men in her yard were watching him the way people watch something they are not certain about and do not want to make the wrong assumption about. His hand was not on his gun. He had not touched it. He simply stood there and looked at the 4 men with the patient, absolute attention of someone who has already calculated everything he needs to know. "Who's he?" one of the mounted men said, with an aggression that was thinner than it was trying to sound. "Marshal Warren," he said. His voice was the same unhurried, level voice that it always was. "Deputy United States Marshal, I'd recommend you gentlemen go home." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that is wait. They went. She stood on her porch and watched them go until the hoofbeats faded, and then she let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. "Thank you," she said. "They'll be back," he said. "But not tonight and probably not just 4. He turned and looked at her. In the darkness on the porch, she was close enough to see the worry on his face that he had kept off it while the men were there. "I'm going to sleep in your barn tonight." "You don't have to," Mabel, just her name, said in that voice. "Please." She thought about the note under the door. She thought about Crow's flat gray eyes. She thought about being practical, which she always was, and being safe, which was practical. "There's a blanket on the shelf by the tack," she said. "It's cold at night now." "I know," he said. "I'll manage." "I'll bring you coffee in the morning," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I would appreciate that," he said. She went inside and sat at her kitchen table for a long time after that, with the lamp turned low, and thought about everything that had accumulated in the space between her and Marshal Warren over the past several weeks. The careful conversations and the shared work, and the moments when he said her name, and the fact that she had stood on her porch, not because she needed protection, but because she could not stand the idea of him facing 4 of Crow's men without her beside him. She thought about what that meant, and then she admitted, quietly and with the particular seriousness she brought to everything important, that she was in love with him. The timing was terrible. The situation was dangerous. The appropriate thing to do was to wait until it was over and think clearly from a position of safety, rather than from the heightened circumstances of notes under doors and 4 horsemen in her yard at night. She took the lamp to bed and was asleep in 10 minutes, which told her something about how much easier it was to sleep knowing someone she trusted was in her barn. The next 8 days were the longest of her life, and simultaneously, in some complicated way she could not fully articulate, the best. Marshal Warren sent his report to Abilene. 2 additional federal officers arrived in Clearwater on a Saturday, riding in with the stage, which was a better cover than arriving on horseback. He briefed them in her kitchen, at her table, which had become the unofficial headquarters of the investigation by virtue of being the only location in the valley where they were certain no one connected to Crow was listening. She fed them coffee and cornbread and sat at the end of the table and said nothing unless she had something useful to add, which was not infrequently. She rode out with him to the Vasquez property on a Tuesday morning, because Elena Vasquez had been willing to make a formal statement but not comfortable doing it with strangers she had never met, and Mabel had been to the Vasquez place twice already and had earned enough trust to make the introduction. Elena was a small, fierce woman in her 40s who had built that property with her husband Juan over 15 years, and watching her describe what Crow had done to them. The manufactured debt, the altered documents, the pressure and threats made Mabel's hands tight on her knees and her jaw set. She and Marshall rode back to town in the late afternoon, and the October light was extraordinary, turning the grass gold and the mountains purple, and she was looking at the mountains when he said, "You're remarkable, you know." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead, not her, which was why he had been able to say it. "I'm practical," she said. "You're brave," he said. "And you care. About the Vasquez family, about your father, about this valley. You've been here 3 months, and you care more about it than most people who have been here their whole lives." She did not know what to say to this, which was unusual. She looked back at the mountains. "I think," she said carefully after a moment, "that I'm going to want to stay here when this is over. I came because of obligation, and I'm staying because it's mine. The quarter section, the garden, my father was happy here." "He was," Marshall said. "I could see it in his papers." She looked at him again. "You'll go back to Abilene." "That's where the office is," he said. They were quiet for a while. The horses found their rhythm, and the road curved through stands of cottonwood going yellow, and everything was very beautiful and very calm on the surface. And underneath the surface of Mabel Walker, there was something complicated and bright and terrifying moving like a current. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "To go back to Abilene?" He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I'm not sure I know what I want. I've been moving for a long time. Moving feels like a thing I know how to do. Stopping feels like a thing you don't. It's harder," he said quietly. She understood that. She had stopped in Clearwater in the middle of a hostile environment, because stopping was what she had needed to do, what the property and her father's memory and her own stubborn love of putting down roots had demanded. She understood the difficulty of it. She also understood with a clarity that surprised her that she wanted him to stop too, but she was not going to say that. Not yet. Not while Crow was still out there and the situation was still dangerous and everything was still compressed and urgent. She was going to be patient and sensible and let things unfold as they would. The arrest happened on a Wednesday. Marshall and the 2 federal officers went to Crow's office at the feed store with the warrant that had come from the federal district court on the Monday stage, along with a surveyor sent to make official copies of the county records. Crow was there, as he always was on Wednesday mornings, and the confrontation was apparently brief and furious on Crow's side and very quiet on Marshall's side. And it was over in 20 minutes. She heard about it from Arthur Prentice, who had been watching from across the street with the barely contained excitement of a man who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. He came to her garden, where she was putting it to bed for the winter, covering the last of the plants against the coming frost, and told her in a rush, and she kept her hands working in the soil and let the news settle over her. Aldous Crow was in federal custody. The county records had been impounded. The deputy county sheriff who had been his informant had been taken in for questioning. 3 other men connected to the scheme were being looked for. The betrayal that had run through this valley for years, quietly destroying families and livelihoods, was over. She went inside and washed her hands and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and cried, very briefly and very quietly, from relief. Marshall Warren came to her door that evening. She had known he would. She opened it before he knocked because she had been listening for his footsteps. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes after sustained tension finally releases its grip, when the body suddenly remembers all the things it has been too alert to feel. He had taken off his gun belt, she noticed, and hung it over his shoulder rather than wearing it, as though he was already in the process of becoming something other than what he had been here. "It's done," he said. "I know. Arthur told me." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in and sat at her table, her father's table, which had been theirs for weeks now, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him. They were quiet for a while. Outside the window the dark was full and soft, and somewhere down the road someone was burning a fire, and the smell of it came through the thin wall of the house. "The original document from your father goes into federal evidence," he said. "But you'll have a copy, and the county records will be corrected. The debt as Crow filed it is void. What you actually owe, based on your father's original agreement, is approximately, with 2 years of legitimate interest, something under $300. There are funds in the federal case that may cover that entirely, depending on how the judge rules." She absorbed this. "My father's name will be cleared," he said, formally. "The federal filing will specify that the debt was fraudulently inflated and that Thomas Walker was a victim of the scheme, not a participant in any dishonesty." She felt her throat tight. "He would have cared about that," she said softly, "more than the money." "I think he would," Marshall said gently. She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him. "When do you go back to Abilene?" The quiet between the question and the answer was a specific kind of quiet, the kind that has something inside it. "I was going to ask you something," he said, "before I think about going anywhere." She waited. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she had come to understand as something he did when he was preparing to say something he had thought through very carefully. "I told you that stopping feels hard," he said. "I've been thinking about why that is. And I think it's because when you stop, you have to be somewhere, actually be somewhere. And for a long time there was nowhere I particularly wanted to be." She was very still. "There's somewhere I want to be now," he said. He looked up from the table and met her eyes, and everything in his face was open in a way she had not seen before, all the careful economy of expression stripped away. "I realize that this has been a compressed sort of acquaintance, and I realize that I have not been I am not a man who is particularly good at saying," he stopped, started again. "Mabel, I would like to stay, if you would give me the chance to earn the right to be somewhere near where you are. I know that's asking something significant." She thought about the night at the social, a man crossing a crowded room because nobody else was going to. She thought about fence posts and cornbread, and the way he said her name, the first time and every time after. She thought about standing on her porch beside him in the dark, not because she needed protection but because she could not stand the distance. "You've already earned it," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You earned it," she said, "the moment you crossed that room." They sat with that for a moment. And then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and it was such a simple thing, such a careful and deliberate and gentle thing, and she turned her hand palm up beneath his and held on. The next weeks were a different kind of time. Not the urgency and danger of before, but something steadier and equally new, the particular sweetness of two people discovering each other, without the pressure of immediate threat pressing them together. Marshall went back to Abilene to file his reports and deal with the formal end of the investigation, and he was gone for 10 days that Mabel spent closing up the garden properly and thinking, and writing him a letter that she rewrote 3 times before she was satisfied with it. His reply came on the 12th day. It was short. It said, "I am coming back as soon as I can get myself released from this office, which I expect will be by the 1st of November. I have been offered a position with the county sheriff's office in Clearwater effective with the new year, if you think that is a reasonable thing for a man to pursue. I think it is a reasonable thing. I would very much like your thoughts, though I expect you will have several of them and some of them will be pointed. I find I am looking forward to the pointed ones especially. Yours, Marshall Warren." She read it twice. Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that took over her whole face and could not be argued with, and sat down to reply. He arrived back in Clearwater on November 2nd, which was a Thursday, with his gear in his saddlebags and a different quality of arrival than the first time, less of a man passing through and more of a man arriving. She was at the door when he rode up the road because she had been watching for him, and she did not pretend she had not been. He swung down from the horse and looked at her across the yard, and she looked back. And then she came down off the porch and across the yard, and he met her in the middle of it. And that was how they were when he kissed her for the first time, standing in her yard in the November cold with his horse looking on, and the sky the particular pale gray of very late autumn. And it was tender and serious and thorough in the way that he did most things. "Hello," he said against her hair after. "Hello," she said. "I've been thinking about that for some time," he said. "So have I," she said, "since approximately October 3rd. She felt him laugh, genuinely and fully, and it was even better than she had thought it would be. He took the position with the county sheriff's office, and it suited him in the way that some things suit people not because they are easy but because they are right. He was good at keeping the peace in the way that people who have seen real violence are good at it, understanding that peace requires work, requires attention, requires the willingness to address small problems before they become large ones. The valley respected him. Some people were afraid of him, and he allowed that and did not abuse it. Others simply trusted him, and he valued that more. By December, she had introduced him to the few people in Clearwater who had been genuinely kind to her: Arthur Prentice, and the Vasquez family, and old Mrs. Cole who kept bees and had been the first woman to speak to Mabel without ice in her voice on her 4th day in town. By Christmas, those connections had expanded, because the removal of Crow's influence had done what she had hoped it would. It had allowed people who had been afraid to act decent to start acting decent again. Dolores Hatch apologized to her in the Mercantile, stiffly and imperfectly but sincerely, in early December. Margaret Finch brought by a pie at Christmas, which was unasked for and unexpected, and Mabel accepted it with the grace she kept in reserve for complicated social moments. The Harmon family, whose 40 acres were beginning the long legal process of being restored, had her and Marshall to supper in January, and the warmth at that table was something she carried with her for weeks. He proposed in February, on a morning when the snow was heavy and the world outside her windows was silent and white, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and they were both drinking coffee, and he had been looking at her for several minutes before he said anything. "Mabel." "Yes," she said without looking up from her mending. "Will you marry me?" She put down her mending. She looked at him. His face was entirely serious and entirely open and entirely certain, which was the part that got her the certainty. Marshall Warren, who had been moving for years and had learned to stop, was entirely certain about this. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He smiled. That smile that transformed his face. She had accumulated a private store of them by now, each one slightly different, and this one was new and the best of all of them. Warm and deep and so glad that it reached all the way into the green of his eyes. They were married in April 1883, in the church that had been receiving Mabel Walker with cold politeness since August and now found itself unexpectedly full for her wedding. Arthur Prentice gave her away, because he was her friend and had earned the honor. Elena Vasquez sat in the front pew and wept with an unself-conscious happiness that made Mabel's heart ache beautifully. Even Dolores Hatch was there, sitting in the back, which was something. The ceremony was simple, and they meant every word of it, which made it the most complicated and profound thing Mabel had done in her 24 years of life. She stood in the church in the white dress that Mrs. Cole had helped her make and looked at Marshall Warren at the altar and thought, "Here, this is where I stop moving to." The spring turned into summer, and summer was full and sweet and busy. The legal matter of the Crow debt was settled in April by the federal court, which ruled that the fraudulently inflated portion was void, and that the original debt, with legitimate interest, would be offset against funds recovered from Crow's assets. Mabel Walker, Mabel Warren now, though she kept her father's name attached to her own in the manner of the land record, owed nothing. The quarter section was entirely, legally debt-free. She planted a larger garden that summer. The fence held. Marshall helped her extend the kitchen garden, and she helped him choose the 3 additional horses he had been wanting, since the county position had confirmed itself permanent. And they disagreed cheerfully about a bay mare he wanted, and she thought was underweight. And she was right about the underweight, but the mare turned out to be a fine animal once she was fed properly. And Marshall reminded her of this approximately twice per month for the rest of the year. That summer was also when the Vasquez family's land case concluded in their favor. 47 acres of water-rich land returned to Juan and Elena Vasquez. The county recorder's correction formally entered. The fraudulent Crow claim struck from the record. When Arthur Prentice published the story in the Clearwater paper, he quoted Mabel in it, which she had not expected, and which made her mother's sister send a letter all the way from Ohio saying she had seen the story reprinted in the Abilene paper and was very proud and also wanted to know more about this husband. By September, the first anniversary of the Harvest Social, she was expecting their first child. She told Marshall on a quiet evening in their kitchen, because everything important in their life together seemed to happen in that kitchen at that table. He was very still for a moment when she told him. Then he came around the table and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with an expression that contained things she could not name and did not need to because she felt them all herself. "A family," he said softly. "A family," she agreed. The Harvest Social that September was very different from the one the year before. They went together, she and Marshall, and there was no awkward pause at the door, no question of where to sit. People saved them seats, actually called across the room, moved over on benches, made space. It was not entirely without its complications, because human nature does not transform entirely in a year, and there were still people in the room who were warmer to them because they were afraid of Marshall than because they had genuinely changed. Mabel knew the difference. She always knew the difference, but there was also genuine warmth. The Vasquez family at one table, waving. Arthur Prentice at another, with a woman he was obviously charmed by and had not yet introduced to anyone. Old Mrs. Cole and her bees and her steadfast decency, sitting near the fiddle player because she liked music. The Harmon family, who had brought 3 kinds of pie. A room full of people who were, most of them, simply trying to live decently in a difficult place, which was all anyone was ever really doing. She sat beside her husband. She was still getting used to that word, and suspected she would enjoy the process of getting used to it for a very long time, and ate roasted corn, and watched the fiddle player, and felt the evening settle around her like something she had been waiting for. "A year ago," Marshall said quietly, leaning close, "I walked into this hall and there was a woman standing in the doorway with a jar of peaches looking like she was about to commit to absolute dignity in the face of extraordinary rudeness. 'And you interfered,' she said. 'I did,' he agreed, with no regret whatsoever. 'Why?' she asked, the same question she had asked a year ago in her garden. Actually, the real answer. He looked at her. The fiddle was playing something quick and lively, and people were beginning to push back tables for dancing. And the light was warm and amber, and everything in his face was exactly what she knew it to be by now. 'Because you were the most remarkable person in the room,' he said simply, 'and nobody was seeing it, and I couldn't walk past that.' She turned toward him and he met her halfway, and the brief kiss between them was witnessed by perhaps half the room, which was fine. Let them witness it. Let them see what this was. A year ago she had stood in this doorway and been invisible, and she was not invisible anymore, and not because she had borrowed his presence or his badge or his reputation. She had built her own place in this valley, stone by stone, in ways people were only beginning to fully understand. But she was glad he had crossed the room. She was glad every single day. Their son was born in the early months of 1884, in February, when the snow was still on the ground, and the world was quiet and white outside the window of the room where he made his first entrance into the world. Marshall was there, which was not so common in those days, but was the kind of specific, stubborn preference that Mabel had expressed with enough clarity that the doctor had simply accepted it without argument. He held her hand and did not faint, which she had privately not been certain about, and when their son was placed in his arms, he looked at the child with an expression that dismantled everything careful about his face and left only the wonder. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Marshall Warren, which was a significant name for a small person, but she thought he would grow into it. She watched her husband hold her son in the lamplight of that February evening, and felt the full weight of everything that had brought them here: the letter from the lawyer, the 2 trunks and the carpet bag, The cold shoulders and the empty benches and the preserved peaches no one wanted to sit near. The note under the door and the four men in the yard and the October afternoon light on the road to the Vasquez property. All of it had been the path, and the path had led here. Thomas was an easy baby, by the measure of babies, which meant he was chaos with good intervals. He had his father's eyes and her stubbornness, which Marshall found enormously funny when he pointed it out, and she found enormously accurate when she was honest with herself. By the time he was 6 months old, he was crawling toward the dog they had acquired from the Harmon farm, a hound called Pepper who was ancient and tolerant, and seemed to regard Thomas as a natural phenomenon to be patiently endured. The valley healed slowly, as things that have been damaged by sustained corruption take time to heal. The families who had lost land were in various stages of reclaiming it, legally and practically. The county recorder's office had a new man in it by 1884, appointed in the clean sweep that had followed Crow's arrest, and was conducting itself with a transparency that was relatively new to this particular corner of the territory. Crow himself was awaiting trial in Abilene, which Mabel read about in the paper, and felt no particular emotion about beyond a distant, clean satisfaction. The deputy county sheriff who had been his informant had taken a deal with the federal office and left the territory. She did not know where he had gone and did not much care, as long as it was away. Arthur Prentice, who had finally introduced the woman he was charmed by as a schoolteacher named Clara who had come to Clearwater to run the new school, got married in the spring of 1884 in a small ceremony that Mabel helped organize and cried at, which she had not expected to do, but found she could not help. Arthur and Clara Prentice were one of those pairs who simply made obvious sense together, and obvious sense in a partnership was, she had decided, one of the loveliest things in the world. Elena and Juan Vasquez became their closest friends, in the way that friendships in those years and places tended to form through shared work and shared meals and shared hardship, and the slow revelation that the other people were the kind of people you wanted beside you when things were hard. Elena and Mabel rode out together once a week, when the weather permitted, and those rides were the closest thing Mabel had had to a sister since she was a child. By the time Thomas was 2 years old and walking with the particular determined wobbliness of toddlers who have decided that speed is more interesting than balance, Mabel was expecting again. This time it was a daughter born in 1886, a small, fierce person they named Ruth, for no particularly complicated reason except that the name suited her from the moment they first looked at her. Ruth had her mother's dark hair, and it would become clear as she grew, her father's quality of patient, absolute attention that missed nothing. The house felt different with Ruth in it, fuller, louder, requiring a kind of organizational genius that Mabel applied herself to with her characteristic practical energy. Marshall took an increasing share of the domestic duties without being asked, and without making it remarkable, because that was simply who he was, and Mabel appreciated it with the specific, bone-deep appreciation of a woman who has seen marriages that were otherwise. Thomas adored his sister with the ferocious tenderness of young children, which mostly expressed itself as hovering near her and occasionally trying to give her rocks, which she could not use. Pepper the hound treated Ruth's arrival with the same philosophical acceptance he had brought to Thomas, as another natural phenomenon to be patiently endured, and then, gradually, as a creature worth bestirring oneself to protect. The years that followed were not simple. The frontier was not simple, and life on a quarter section in the Clearwater Valley was not simple, and raising children and running a household and maintaining a marriage through drought years and hard winters and the ordinary daily accumulation of difficulty, none of that was simple. Marshall's job carried its own weight. A county sheriff's officer in 1880's New Mexico territory dealt with things that required real courage and real judgment, and occasionally real danger, and Mabel lived with that knowledge and did not ask him to be other than what he was, and he did not ask her to be anything other than what she was, which was a woman who called things what they were and loved without conditions, and worked alongside rather than behind. They had a third child in 1888, another son, who arrived in midsummer and was named for Marshall's own father, James. James Warren came into the world with enormous opinions that he expressed loudly and continuously, and Thomas, who was 4 by then, declared him interesting, and Ruth, who was 2, regarded him with deep suspicion that eventually, months later, became a proprietary affection. The house that had been Thomas Walker's, that had been Mabel Walker's, was entirely full now in the best possible way. Full of children and a husband and a dog and a garden that had expanded every spring for 6 years, and now produced more vegetables than they needed, and traded the surplus with the Vasquez family for things that Alina grew that Mabel did not have room for. Full of letters from Arthur and Clara Prentice, who were expecting their own first child. Full of the ordinary richness of a life that had been built deliberately, from the right materials, by people who had known what they were building. On a September evening in 1889, 7 years after Mabel Walker had stood in the doorway of the Clearwater Valley Social Hall with a jar of preserved peaches and a dignity she was holding onto by the skin of her teeth. She sat on her porch in the last of the warm light and watched her children in the yard. Thomas at 5 was already her father's son in some ways, serious and curious and full of ideas that tumbled out of him faster than his mouth could manage. Ruth at 3 was her own absolute self, which was the best possible thing a 3-year-old could be. James at 1 was discovering the extraordinary fact of his own hands with the concentration of a scholar at an important text. Marshall came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her in the other chair, and she took the cup he offered, and they sat quietly in the way they did sometimes, the quiet that is full rather than empty, the silence between people who have said enough important things that they can afford to just be still together. "I was thinking," he said after a while, "about the social. September," she said. "It always makes you think about it. You were so," he searched for the word. "You were so prepared to be alone," he said. "You had made your peace with it, I could see that. You were going to stand in that doorway until you decided it wasn't worth it, and then you were going to turn around and go home." "I was," she admitted. "What would have happened if I hadn't come in that night?" She thought about it honestly. "I would have gone home," she said. "I would have kept going home every time until eventually I either broke them down by sheer persistence or decided the valley wasn't worth fighting for and left. And I think I would have stayed eventually. I'm stubborn." She glanced at him. "But it would have been a long time, and it would have been very lonely, and I would have been a different person by the time it was over." "I'm glad I came in," he said. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The light was going now, the mountains turning from purple to blue to dark, and the children in the yard were heading toward the stage of the evening where they needed to be called in and fed and bathed and managed toward bedtime. And there would be noise and complexity, and Thomas would have opinions about supper, and Ruth would refuse to be bathed without the specific small rubber toy duck that Marshall had brought home from a trip to Abilene, and that had become a non-negotiable part of the evening routine. And James would simply beam at everyone with the specific, uncomplicated delight of a 1-year-old who finds the world perpetually wonderful, which was something Mabel tried to take note of and carry with her into the harder parts of the day. She was going to call them in a moment. But for right now, in this specific minute of this September evening, she stayed where she was with her coffee and her husband beside her and the children in the golden last of the light, and she felt the full weight of everything, the grief and the loneliness and the betrayal and the dangerous weeks and the growing warmth and the love, and she let it all be true at once, all of it, because that was what a real life was. It was all of it, and it was hers, and she had fought for every inch of it. "Marshall," she said. "Yes, I'm glad we stopped," she said. He reached over and took her free hand, as he had on the night in her kitchen when everything was becoming what it was going to be, and she felt the familiar warmth and weight of it. "So am I," he said. "More than I know how to say." She turned to look at him in the evening light, this man who had walked across a crowded room for her when the world had decided she was worth ignoring, and felt the love move through her in the clean, full way it did when she let herself simply feel it without thinking around it. "You don't have to say it," she told him. "I know." Thomas Walker's quarter section, filed in 1874 under the Homestead Act of 1862, titled to Mabel Walker, and then to Mabel and Marshall Warren in 1883, would stay in the Warren family for 3 generations. The house that had held Thomas Walker's surveying journals and his massive oak desk, that had been the headquarters of a federal investigation and the site of the most important conversations of 2 people's lives, was added onto in 1890 when James showed signs of needing his own room, and again in 1892 when Mabel was expecting their 4th child, a daughter they named Clara, for Arthur Prentice's wife, which made Arthur cry in a way he was completely unembarrassed about. The garden kept growing, the fence held, through winters and dry summers and the ordinary wear of years, because it had been built right the first time and maintained with care, which was true of the marriage too. Aldous Crowe was convicted in federal court in 1885 and sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary. The county records that he had corrupted were formally corrected. The families he had damaged recovered, some more fully than others, in the way that recovery from sustained injustice tends to work, imperfectly, slowly, with residual losses that could not be entirely undone. The Vasquez family's land was theirs and remained so. The Harmon family rebuilt. Thomas Walker's name appeared in the federal court record as a victim, not a debtor, and Mabel read that portion of the record and felt her father present in the room with her in the way that the dead sometimes are, briefly and fully, and without warning. Arthur Prentice published the story of the Crowe conviction in the Clearwater paper, and it was picked up in Abilene and Santa Fe, and people read it, and the valley was known, briefly, as the place where the federal government had taken on a corrupt land speculator and won. It was not the worst thing to be known as. The Clearwater Valley Social became something Mabel looked forward to every September, which was not something she had anticipated. She brought different things every year: peaches in good peach years, pickled green tomatoes in other years, once an elaborate dried apple cake that Mrs. Cole had taught her to make. She never arrived to find an empty doorway. She never arrived to find no room on the benches. And every year, she thought about the woman who had stood there 7 years ago, or 8 years ago, or however many years ago, with her preserved peaches and her held-together dignity, and felt a tenderness for her that was specific and real. That woman had not known what was coming. Had not known about Marshall Warren or the investigation, or the love that was going to build itself carefully and stubbornly and permanently, in the space between 2 people who had both learned that worthwhile things required the willingness to stay. She was glad that woman had stayed. She was glad, every morning, that she woke in the house on the quarter section with the mountains in the window and her husband's arm warm across her, and the children asleep down the hall, every morning without exception, that she had stayed. Some things in life are earned through persistence, and some through luck, and some through the extraordinary event of being in the right room at the right moment when someone decides to cross it. The truth was that Mabel Walker's life in the Clearwater Valley had been earned through all 3, and she was practical enough to acknowledge each one and grateful enough to hold them all. She held them. She stayed. She grew, and the garden grew, and the family grew, and the years went by in the way that good years do, not always easily, but fully, richly, with the specific texture of a life that has been lived rather than survived. And in the Clearwater Valley, in the years that followed, there was a story that people told. They told it at socials and at church and at kitchen tables and across back fences in the particular way that stories that matter get told, which is repeatedly and with small embellishments that never change the essential truth of the thing. The story was this: that once, On a September evening in 1882, a woman had come to the Valley Social with a jar of preserved peaches, and no one had made room for her. And a man had walked in off the trail and crossed the whole length of the room to sit beside her, in front of everybody, without a moment's hesitation. And that those two people had built something in this valley that was worth building. That was the story. It was true in every particular. And it ended as the best stories do, not in a dramatic final moment, but in the ongoing, ordinary dailiness of a life that contained love, the September light on the mountains, and the children in the yard, and the coffee on the porch, and the hand held, and the word home meaning something specific and good and fully arrived at. That was how it ended. That was how it began again, every morning,